The silence of the Blackwood was not empty. It was heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. It was a silence that didn't suggest the absence of life, but rather the holding of breath, a collective pause by nature itself, waiting for something inevitable and terrible to happen. Elena adjusted the strap of her backpack, the nylon cutting into her shoulder, though the physical discomfort was a distant second to the gnawing anxiety in her gut. The canopy above was so dense that the twilight struggled to penetrate the weaving of pine needles and gnarled branches, casting everything in a bruised, purple hue. "I'm telling you, the trail marker was pointing this way," Mark said, his voice too loud, too confident. He was hacking at a cluster of ferns with a stick he'd picked up miles back, acting the part of the fearless leader to mask the fact that his hands were trembling. "Mark, we passed that crooked oak tree 20 minutes ago," Sarah whispered, her eyes glued to the compass on her wrist, though the needle had been spinning lazily, uselessly for the last hour. "We're walking in circles. We need to stop before we lose the light completely." "And do what? Sleep on the moss?" Mark snapped, turning back to face them. His face was pale, slick with a sheen of cold sweat that caught the dying light. "The car is dead, Sarah. No signal, no GPS. Moving is the only option." Trailing behind them, Leo stumbled over an exposed root, letting out a sharp curse. "Guys, seriously, my ankle is killing me. Can we just take 5? Elena stopped, looking back at Leo. He looked small against the backdrop of the towering ancient redwoods. The fog had begun to roll in, distinct from the mist of the afternoon. This was thicker, unnatural, curling around the tree trunks like white spectral fingers. It smelled of wet earth and something else, something copper and metallic, like old pennies. "Just a minute," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Let's just catch our breath." The group huddled together, an instinctual formation against the encroaching dark. The temperature was dropping rapidly, a chill that seemed to seep through their jackets and settle in their marrow. Elena looked out into the labyrinth of trees. The woods felt wrong. The geometry of the forest seemed to shift in her peripheral vision. Trees appeared closer than they had been a moment ago. Shadows stretched into impossible shapes. "Did you hear that?" Leo asked, freezing mid-motion as he reached for his water bottle. "Hear what?" Mark demanded, though he stopped swinging his stick. "Crunching," Leo whispered, his eyes wide, staring into the thicket behind them. "Like heavy boots on dry leaves, but slow, deliberate." They strained their ears. At first, there was only the wind sighing through the upper branches. Then, Elena heard it. It wasn't just a footstep. It was a rhythmic, wet thud. Step, drag, step, drag. It was the sound of something injured, or perhaps something carrying a heavy burden. "It's probably a deer," Mark said, but he didn't believe it. He backed up, stepping closer to Sarah. "Deer don't drag their feet," Sarah hissed, clutching Elena's arm. Her grip was bruising. The fog thickened, swirling around their waists now, obscuring the ground. The sound stopped. The sudden cessation was worse than the noise itself. It implied intelligence. It implied that whatever was out there had realized it was being listened to. "We need to move," Elena said, the urgency rising in her throat like bile. "Now, quietly." They began to back away, moving deeper into the gloom, away from where the sound had originated. Every snap twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to deafen her. She kept glancing back, her eyes playing tricks on her. Was that a shadow detaching itself from a tree trunk? Was that the glint of metal in the dark? Suddenly, a sound tore through the air, a low, guttural whistle. It didn't sound human, yet it possessed a mockery of a melody, a twisted nursery rhyme carried on the wind. Whistle, pause, whistle. "Run," Mark whispered, then louder, panic shattering his facade. "Run!" The group bolted. Logic and direction were abandoned for the primal need to put distance between themselves and the whistler. Elena sprinted, branches whipping against her face, leaving stinging welts on her cheeks. She could hear Sarah panting beside her, and the heavy thud of Mark's boots ahead. "Leo!" Sarah screamed, glancing back. Elena turned her head for a fraction of a second. Leo had fallen behind, his injured ankle betraying him. He was limping, his face twisted in terror, looking back into the wall of fog. Through the swirling mist, a silhouette emerged. It was towering, impossibly tall, wearing what looked like a tattered, oil-stained trench coat that hung loosely over a gaunt frame. But it was the face, or the lack thereof, that froze the blood in Elena's veins. Where a face should be, there was a mask made of burlap, crude stitches forming a jagged, permanent grin. The figure raised a hand. It held something heavy, a rusted cleaver that dripped dark fluid onto the forest floor. "Help me!" Leo shrieked, scrambling to get up, but the mud offered no purchase. Elena skid to a halt, torn between the instinct to survive and the horror of leaving her friend. She took a step back toward him, reaching out her hand. "Leo, get up!" But the figure was faster than its limping gait suggested. It lunged with terrifying speed, a blur of motion in the gray light. It didn't strike Leo. It simply grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and yanked him backward into the fog with effortless, inhuman strength. Leo's scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, choking gurgle and the sound of fabric tearing. Then silence returned, instant and absolute. "Elena, move!" Mark grabbed her jacket, hauling her away. She stumbled, tears blurring her vision, her mind unable to process the violence she had just witnessed. They ran blindly, crashing through briar patches that tore at their jeans. The forest seemed to be hurting them, the trees closing in, funneling them down a steep incline. They slid down a muddy embankment, tumbling over roots and rocks until they hit the bottom of a ravine. Gasping for air, lungs burning, the three survivors huddled behind a massive fallen log. "Is he?" Sarah was sobbing quietly, her hand over her mouth. "Don't!" Mark hissed, his eyes wild. "Don't say it. Just listen." They lay in the dirt, the smell of rot overwhelming down here. Elena pressed her ear against the damp wood of the log. Above them, at the top of the ridge they had just tumbled down, the whistling started again. But this time, it was accompanied by a new sound. It was the sound of a heavy object sliding down the mud, following their path. Elena looked at Mark, then at Sarah. They were trapped in the ravine. The walls were too steep to climb quickly. The only way out was forward, into the pitch-black darkness of a cave mouth that gaped open at the end of the gully. "Into the cave?" Mark mouthed, pointing. "We can't." Sarah shook her head frantically. "We'll be cornered." The sliding sound stopped just a few yards above them. The crunch of boots on gravel followed. The killer was down here with them. Elena looked at the cave, then at the ridge. The footsteps were getting closer, slow and savoring. She saw the shadow stretch over the log they were hiding behind. The tip of the rusted cleaver appeared over the edge of the wood, inches from Mark's head, dripping something warm onto his shoulder. Elena scrambled backward, her hand finding a loose rock. She opened her mouth to scream a warning, but the air was sucked from her lungs as a hand, cold, rough, and smelling of earth, shot out from the darkness of the cave behind her and clamped tight over her mouth, dragging her backward into the abyss. The scream died in her throat, smothered by the calloused palm, reducing her terror to a muffled, vibrating hum against the stranger's flesh. Elena kicked out, her heels scraping uselessly against the loose shale of the cave floor as she was hauled backward into the suffocating gloom. The darkness swallowed her whole, an abrupt transition from the gray twilight of the ravine to a blackness so absolute it felt viscous, like oil filling her eyes. "Quiet!" A voice rasped in her ear, sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Or he flays us all." The hand released her, but before she could scramble away, a grip of iron seized her wrist, pinning her behind a jagged formation of limestone. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gasped for air, the atmosphere in here distinct from the forest, stagnant, cold, and smelling of wet minerals and something metallic, like old coins. From her vantage point in the shadows, she looked back toward the cave mouth, a ragged oval of lesser darkness. Outside, the horror unfolded in a sequence of jagged movements. The rusted cleaver, which had been poised to split Mark's skull, slammed down into the rotting log with a wet thwack that echoed sickeningly off the ravine walls. Mark, propelled by pure adrenaline, had thrown himself sideways just a fraction of a second before the impact. "Run!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking. He grabbed Sarah by the jacket, hauling her up from the mud. The killer, a hulking silhouette against the dim light, wrenched the cleaver free from the wood. He didn't rush. That was the terrifying part. He moved with the lethargic, inevitable momentum of a landslide. He stepped over the log, his heavy boots squelching in the mire, directly toward the cave entrance where Elena had vanished. "In! Go in!" Mark shoved Sarah toward the gap. They burst into the cave, stumbling blindly, their breathing ragged and loud in the confined space. They collided with Elena and her captor, a tangle of limbs and panic. "Move!" the stranger hissed. A match flared to life, blindingly bright in the obsidian dark. Elena blinked, tears streaming down her face. The illumination revealed a man who looked as though he had been part of the earth for years. His clothes were rags, caked in clay, and his eyes were wide, milky orbs of perpetual fear. He didn't look at them. He looked past them, toward the entrance. The light of the match flickered, casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the dripping stalactites. "He knows this throat," the stranger whispered, his voice trembling. "He feeds it." "Who are you? Where is he?" Sarah whimpered, clutching Mark's arm so hard her knuckles were white. "Deep. We must go deep. The echo chamber confuses him," the man muttered, turning and hobbling deeper into the tunnel. He held the match protectively, cupping the flame. "We can't follow him," Mark whispered to Elena, his chest heaving. "He's crazy." "We can't go back," Elena replied, her voice hollow. She pointed to the entrance. The faint gray light of the outside world was blocked. The massive shape of the killer stood at the threshold. He didn't enter immediately. He stood there, blocking their exit, a gatekeeper to hell. Then the sound began again, the whistling. It bounced off the cave walls, distorted by the acoustics, sounding like it was coming from everywhere at once. It was a jaunty, discordant tune, made infinitely worse by the environment. Then came the sound of metal scraping against stone. Scrape, step, scrape, step. He was dragging the cleaver along the cave wall as he walked. Move! Elena shoved Mark. They scrambled after the ragged stranger, plunging deeper into the bowels of the earth. The cave was not a straight tunnel. It was a labyrinth of twisting fissures and slippery slopes. The floor was uneven, littered with debris that crunched ominously underfoot. Twigs, stones, and things Elena refused to identify in the dying light of the stranger's match. The air grew thinner, colder. They squeezed through narrow gaps that scraped the skin from their shoulders, the stone pressing in on them with claustrophobic weight. Every time they paused for breath, the scraping sound echoed behind them, faint but relentless. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He was hurting them. Wait. The stranger halted abruptly. The match burned down to his fingertips, and he dropped it, plunging them into blindness for a second before he struck another. The flare illuminated a cavernous room, the ceiling lost in darkness high above. The split, the stranger breathed. Left is water, right is down. Which way is out? Mark demanded, grabbing the man's tattered shirt. Out? The man laughed, a dry, wheezing sound that bordered on hysteria. There is no out. Once he marks you, there is only longer. Left, Elena decided, hearing the faint trickle of water. Running water might lead to a river, an exit. They ran toward the sound of water. The ground became slick, coated in a thick, slimy algae. Sarah slipped, crying out as her knee slammed into a rock. But Mark hauled her up, not letting her stop. The whistling was getting louder again, defying the distance they had put between them and the entrance. They reached an underground stream, black and rushing fast. "Cross it!" Mark yelled. They waded in. The water was freezing, numbing their legs instantly, the current strong enough to threaten their balance. They reached the other side, shivering, teeth chattering violently. "He won't follow in the water," Sarah hoped aloud, her voice trembling. "It'll hide our scent." The ragged stranger turned to them, his face illuminated from below by the dying match, making him look like a ghoul. "Scent?" he whispered. "He doesn't hunt by scent, girl. He hunts by fear, and you are reeking of it." Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone above them. It pressed against their eardrums, a physical weight. Elena held her breath, straining to hear the scrape of the cleaver, the heavy boots. Nothing. "We lost him," Mark exhaled, his body sagging with relief. "No," the stranger whispered, backing away, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead of them, not behind. The acoustics, the echoes. Elena felt a drop of something warm hit her cheek. She touched it, bringing her fingers to the light of the match. It was red. She looked up. From the darkness of the ceiling directly above them, a heavy, rhythmic, dripping sound began, and then, descending from a hidden, majestic shelf high in the cavern gloom, the whistling started again. It wasn't behind them. It was waiting for them. Before anyone could scream, the match flickered and died, plunging them into absolute, screaming darkness. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a suffocating, viscous substance that seemed to pour into their eyes, noses, and mouths. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rushing of the black stream behind them and the frantic, drum roll beat of Elena's own heart. Then came the impact. It was a heavy, wet thud, the sound of dense meat and iron hitting stone, landing directly where they had been standing mere seconds before. The vibration traveled through the slick cavern floor, jarring Elena's bones. "Run!" Mark choked out, his voice a raw scrape in the void. He grabbed for them blindly, his fingers bruising Elena's arm as he hauled her backward. They scrambled away from the stream, boots sliding on the algae-slicked rock. There was no direction, only away. Elena extended her free hand, fingers splayed, grasping at the empty air until her palm met the cold, damp slime of a cavern wall. "Keep to the wall," she hissed, the command barely more than a breath. "Don't let go of the wall." Behind them, the darkness came alive. It wasn't just the sound of pursuit, it was the deliberate, theatrical slowness of it. Click, drag, step. The heavy boot struck the stone, followed by the metallic rasp of the cleaver being dragged along the floor. Sparks erupted, brief, violent showers of orange that slashed through the gloom, acting like a terrifying strobe light. In those fleeting flashes, Elena saw him. He was a mountain of tattered rags and wet leather, looming impossibly tall. The sparks illuminated a mask, or perhaps a face, that was a ruin of scar tissue and malice. And he wasn't running, he was sauntering. The whistling resumed. It was a jaunty, disjointed tune, bouncing off the cavern walls, creating a disorienting echo chamber. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, from the ceiling, from the floor, from inside their own skulls. "He's toying with us," the stranger rasped. He was ahead of them, moving with an eerie, practiced fluidity in the dark. "He feeds on the panic. Don't give it to him. Breathe through your nose. Quiet your hearts." "Easy for you to say," Sarah sobbed, stumbling. Her injured knee buckled, and she went down hard, splashing into a puddle of stagnant water. The dragging sound of the cleaver stopped instantly. The silence that followed was more violent than the noise. Elena froze, her hand gripping the slimy rock wall so hard her fingernails threatened to snap. Mark was crouching, trying to pull Sarah up, but the movement was noisy, a cacophony of rustling fabric and splashing water in the acoustic perfection of the cave. "Sarah, get up," Mark whispered, panic finally cracking his stoic facade. "I can't," she wept, the pain in her voice jagged. "It's twisted." A low chuckle rolled through the cavern, vibrating in the air like the purr of a giant cat. It was close, too close. "Leave her," the stranger's voice floated out of the dark, cold and pragmatic. "She is the offering. It is the only way the rest survive." "Go to hell," Mark snarled. He hoisted Sarah onto his back, groaning under the weight. "Elena, guide me. I can't feel the wall with her on me." Elena took the lead, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept one hand on the wall, the other reaching back to grip Mark's shirt. They moved forward, a clumsy, three-headed beast stumbling through the Stygian gloom. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of copper, old, dry blood, and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. The tunnel began to narrow. The walls pressed in, claustrophobic and jagged, tearing at their clothes. The ground sloped downward aggressively, turning into a slide of loose shale and mud. "Faster!" Elena urged, sensing the change in terrain. "It's going down." Behind them, the heavy boots began to pick up the pace. The playful saunter was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, thunderous gait of a predator closing the distance. The whistling shifted pitch, becoming a high, piercing shriek that made Elena's teeth ache. "He's charging!" the stranger yelled from somewhere below them. "Slide! You have to slide." "What's at the bottom?" Mark yelled back. "Does it matter?" The heavy whoosh of air directly behind Elena's neck told her they had no choice. The cleaver swung through the space where her head had been a second before, biting into the stone wall with a shower of sparks that illuminated the killer's hand. Pale, massive, and covered in the same red slime that was drying on her cheek. "Jump!" Elena screamed. She threw herself forward, dragging Mark and Sarah with her. They hit the slope, and the world dissolved into chaos. They tumbled uncontrollably, sliding over sharp rocks and slick mud, bodies colliding, breath knocked from their lungs. The descent seemed endless, a terrifying plunge into the bowels of the earth. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a bone-shattering impact that never came. Instead, the slope leveled out abruptly, dumping them onto a surface that crunched ominously beneath their weight. They rolled to a stop, gasping, coughing, bruised and battered. The darkness here was absolute, heavy, with a smell so foul it made Elena gag, a thick, cloying stench of decay. "Mark? Sarah?" Elena whispered, pushing herself up. Her hand sank into the floor. It wasn't dirt. It was a pile of small, brittle objects. "I'm here," Mark groaned nearby. "I have her." "Where is the stranger?" Sarah asked, her voice thin and terrified. "I am here," the stranger replied. His voice didn't come from beside them, but from above, back up the slope they had just fallen down. "I told you, only longer." "What do you mean?" Elena demanded, dread pooling in her stomach. "I cannot enter the ossuary," the stranger said, his voice receding, tinged with a strange mixture of pity and relief. "The contract does not allow it. He cannot follow you there either, but he does not need to." "Why?" Mark shouted into the dark. "Why doesn't he need to?" The stranger didn't answer. Above them, at the top of the slide, the killer's whistling started again, a slow, mocking lullaby. But then a second sound joined it. From the darkness surrounding them, from the vast, unseen corners of the cavern they had landed in, a sound emerged. It was a dry, clicking rattle, like thousands of dry bones shivering together. And then a low, guttural rasping began, answering the killer's whistle. Elena realized with a jolt of horror what her hands were resting on. They weren't rocks, they were ribs, femurs, skulls. "Mark," Elena whispered, her blood running cold as the clicking grew louder, closing in from all sides. "Light the match, now." I only have one left," Mark stammered. "Light it." Mark struck the match. The flame flared to life, a tiny trembling beacon. The light pushed back the shadows just enough to reveal the truth. They were standing in a cathedral of bones, a pit filled with the remains of centuries. But they were not alone. Rising from the piles of calcium and dust surrounding them in a tight, starving circle were pale, eyeless figures. Their skin was translucent, stretched tight over skeletal frames, and their mouths were open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. As the match burned down to Mark's fingertips, the whistling from above stopped. The creatures hissed in unison. The flame went out. The darkness that followed the extinction of the match was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of absolute void. The afterimage of the creatures, pale, skeletal, with jaws unhinged like vipers, burned neon bright in Elena's retinas for a fraction of a second before fading into the abyss. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the hiss erupted into a screech. "Move!" Elena screamed, lunging forward into the black. Her hands found the rough fabric of Sarah's jacket, yanking her sideways just as the air where Sarah had been standing was sliced by the whistle of claws. "I can't see," Sarah sobbed, stumbling. The ground beneath them shifted treacherously. It was a macabre quicksand of rolling skulls and snapping femurs. Every step was a struggle for balance, accompanied by the sickening crunch of ancient calcium pulverizing under their boots. "Mark!" Elena shouted over the rising cacophony of clicking throats and scrabbling limbs. "Do you have anything else? Anything?" "The camera!" Mark's voice cracked, sounding dangerously close to hysteria. "The flash! It might blind them! Use it! Now!" There was a fumble in the dark, the sound of plastic scraping against zippers, and then, snap flash! The cavern exploded in a blinding burst of white light. The scene was frozen in a horrific tableau. A dozen of the pale things were mid-leap, their translucent skin stretching over protruding ribs, their needle teeth glistening with saliva. They were closer than Elena had dared to imagine. The flash hit them like a physical blow. The creatures recoiled, shrieking and shielding their eyeless faces with long, spindly fingers, their sensitive skin burning under the sudden exposure. "Run!" Mark roared. He triggered the shutter again. Flash! Elena saw a gap in the cavern wall to their left, a narrow fissure, jagged like a wound in the earth, barely wide enough for a person. To the left, the crack in the wall. They scrambled over the unstable mounds of the dead. It was a nightmare of stroboscopic terror. Flash! Sarah fell, her ankle caught between two rib cages. A creature lunged, its mouth opening wide enough to swallow a human head. Darkness. Elena threw herself blindly toward where she had seen Sarah fall. Her hands grasped Sarah's arm. She heaved with all her strength. "Get up!" Flash! Mark was swinging the heavy body of the camera like a flail, striking a creature that had gotten too close. The lens shattered, but the flash capacitor whined and fired again, right in the monster's face. It convulsed, tumbling backward into the bone pile. They reached the fissure. Elena shoved Sarah inside first. The space was tight, claustrophobic, the stone walls slick with a slimy, cold moss. Sarah squeezed through, sobbing for breath. "Go, Mark!" Elena yelled, grabbing his collar. Mark dived into the crevice just as a claw raked the stone inches from his head, sending sparks flying into the dark. Elena followed, scraping her shoulders against the rock, forcing her body through the constriction. The clicking and hissing reached a fever pitch behind them, a chorus of frustrated hunger. Pale arms thrust into the gap, grasping blindly, but the fissure was too narrow for the creature's distended rib cages to pass. Elena scrambled backward, deeper into the tunnel, until the scratching sounds of the dwellers were replaced by the ragged, heaving breaths of her friends. Is everyone okay?" Mark wheezed. The camera hung uselessly around his neck, the flash dead. "I think so," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They stopped. Why did they stop?" "We're too deep," Elena said, leaning against the cold rock wall. "Or the tunnel is too small." They sat in the oppressive silence for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only minutes. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. The air here was different, stagnant, smelling of copper and wet earth. "We have to keep moving," Elena said finally. "We can't stay here if they find another way around." "We have no light," Mark pointed out grimly. "That was the last of the battery." "We feel our way," Elena insisted. "Wall to the right. Keep your hand on it. Don't let go." They moved like ghosts, a chain of terrified humanity shuffling through the bowels of the earth. The tunnel wound downward, twisting in a serpentine coil that made Elena dizzy. The floor smoothed out, the loose bones replaced by hewn stone. They were no longer in a natural formation. They were in something constructed. After a descent that felt endless, the air pressure changed. The oppressive closeness of the tunnel opened up. The echo of their footsteps changed pitch, becoming hollow and vast. "Stop!" Elena hissed. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Look." Ahead of them, in the distance, there was a faint, pulsating luminescence. It wasn't fire, and it wasn't sunlight. It was a sickly, greenish glow emanating from patches of fungi clinging to massive pillars that stretched up into the darkness. They stepped out into a colossal chamber, a sunken amphitheater of cyclopean proportions. In the center of the room lay a black, glassy lake, perfectly still. The green light reflected off the water, creating the illusion of a bottomless sky beneath their feet. "The ossuary," Mark whispered, awe warring with terror. "The stranger said he couldn't enter here." "He said the contract doesn't allow it," Elena corrected, her eyes scanning the perimeter. "That doesn't mean it's safe." They walked toward the water's edge, drawn by a strange compulsion. The silence here was heavy, almost sacred, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence of the bone pit above. "Maybe there's a way out on the other side," Sarah suggested, pointing across the lake where the green glow seemed brighter. "We have to swim?" Mark asked, looking at the ink-black water with distrust. Elena knelt by the edge. The water was unnaturally still. No ripples, no reflection of their faces. It was like Saint erring into a void. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first, bouncing off the high, unseen ceiling, distorting until it was impossible to pinpoint the source. Whistle, low, melodic, mocking. Elena froze. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. "No," Sarah whimpered, backing away from the water. "He's up there. He's up the slide. The stranger said he couldn't follow." The whistling grew louder, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't coming from the tunnel they had just exited. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. Elena looked across the black lake. On the far shore, silhouetted against the patch of glowing fungi, a figure stood. It was tall, wearing a tattered trench coat that hung motionless in the dead air. The figure raised a hand in a lazy, welcoming wave. "The stranger lied," Mark breathed. "No," Elena said, her voice hollow as she watched the figure begin to walk across the surface of the water, his boots not breaking the tension, as if the lake were made of solid glass. "He didn't lie. He said the killer doesn't need to follow us." The whistling stopped. The figure was halfway across the lake now, moving with a supernatural gliding grace. "He was already here," Elena realized, gripping her friend's arms. "We didn't escape. We just ran into the dining room." As the killer drew closer, the green light illuminated his face for the first time. He wasn't smiling. His mouth was sewn shut with thick black thread. And yet the whistling started again, emanating not from his lips, but from the water beneath him, vibrating through the very floor they stood on. The vibration was nauseating. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical intrusion, a resonance that rattled Elena's teeth and blurred her vision. The black lake acted as a massive amplifier, the surface shivering in complex geometric patterns that radiated outward from the killer's boots. "Run!" Mark choked out, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. "Move!" He shoved Elena and Sarah toward the jagged cavern wall, away from the impossible shoreline. The spell of terror broke, replaced by the frantic, clumsy desperation of prey. They scrambled over slick, moss-covered rocks, their breathing ragged and loud in the damp air. Behind them, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the killer's boots transitioned from the unnatural surface of the water to the stone floor. He had made landfall. "Where are we going?" Sarah screamed, slipping on a patch of luminescent slime. She scrambled back up, her hand stained with glowing green ichor. "It's a dead end. It's all a dead end." "Just keep the wall to your right," Elena shouted back, grabbing Sarah's jacket and hauling her forward. "Look for a fissure, a tunnel, anything." The cavern was vast, a subterranean cathedral, built by madness. The glowing fungi that dotted the ceiling pulsed in time with the whistling, a sickening, greenish heartbeat. With every step the killer took, the light flared, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at the trio's ankles. The whistling had evolved. It was no longer a simple melody. It was a chorus of screams compressed into a single, high-pitched tone that drilled into the base of Elena's skull. She glanced back. The figure in the trench coat wasn't running. He was striding with a terrifying, leisurely purpose, like a man walking through his own garden. The black thread sewing his lips shut strained against the skin, and for a horrifying second, Elena saw something writhe beneath the skin of his cheeks, as if the sound were a living thing trying to claw its way out. "There!" Mark yelled, pointing ahead. A fissure split the rock face about 50 yards away, a jagged wound in the stone, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was their only option. The open space of the cavern offered no cover, only the inevitability of the approaching hunter. "Go! Go!" Mark pushed the girls forward, positioning himself at the rear. They sprinted, lungs burning, the damp air tasting of copper and rot. The whistling grew shrill, piercing, causing Sarah to stumble, clapping her hands over her ears. "Get up!" Elena shrieked, hauling her friend to her feet. "Don't listen to it!" They reached the fissure. Up close, it was terrifyingly narrow. A draft of freezing, foul-smelling air rushed out from the darkness within. "Elena, you first," Mark commanded, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The killer was closer now, 20 yards away. The green light illuminated the texture of his coat. It wasn't fabric. It looked like cured patchwork skin, stitched together with the same thick black thread that bound his mouth. Elena didn't argue. She turned sideways and forced herself into the crack. The stone scraped her chest and back, claustrophobia gripping her, the wrote. She shimmied sideways, the darkness swallowing her, until the fissure widened slightly into a rough passage. "Sarah, come on!" Elena reached back into the sliver of light. Sarah squeezed through, sobbing hysterically, her body shaking so violently she kept getting stuck on the rough protrusions of the rock. Elena grabbed her wrist, pulling with all her strength, dragging her friend into the cramped safety of the tunnel. "Mark!" Elena cried out, looking back through the gap. Mark was standing at the entrance of the fissure, but he wasn't turning to follow them. He stood facing the cavern, a large, jagged rock gripped tightly in his hand. "Mark, what are you doing? Get in here!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing in the tight space. "He's too close," Mark said, his voice strangely calm. He didn't look back at them. "He'll just pull us out one by one. I have to stop the noise." "No, Mark, don't be an idiot!" Elena lunged toward the opening, but the space was too tight for two people to pass. She was blocked by the angle of the rock. Through the narrow slit, Elena watched the nightmare unfold. The killer stopped 5 feet from Mark. The whistling cut off abruptly, plunging the cavern into a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. The figure tilted his head. The sewn mouth didn't move, but a voice, wet, guttural, and sounding like it was bubbling up from the bottom of a well, echoed directly into their minds. Guessed. Mark swung the rock with a roar of defiance, aiming for the killer's head. It happened in a blur. The killer didn't dodge. He simply raised a hand, catching Mark's wrist in midair. The sound of bone snapping was sharp and sickening, like a dry branch breaking in winter. Mark screamed, dropping the rock. He fell to his knees, clutching his shattered arm. "Mark!" Elena shrieked, clawing at the stone walls, trying to force her way back out. But Sarah held her back, gripping her waist in a panic-stricken embrace. "We can't help him. We have to go," Sarah wailed. Outside, the killer loomed over the kneeling boy. He reached down, his pale hand gently cupping Mark's chin, tilting his face up toward the green, pulsating light. It was almost a tender gesture, a mockery of comfort. Then the killer placed his other hand on Mark's chest. Elena stopped struggling. She watched, paralyzed, as the black threads on the killer's mouth began to vibrate. The whistling started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the water. It wasn't coming from the killer. Mark's back arched violently. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. His mouth fell open in a silent scream, and then, horrifyingly, his jaw began to tremble. A low melodic whistle emerged from Mark's throat. It was the same tune. The killer stepped back, lowering his hands. He looked at the fissure where Elena and Sarah were hiding, his eyes locking onto Elena's through the darkness. He nodded once, slowly. Mark stood up. His arm hung limp and broken at his side, but he seemed to feel no pain. He turned toward the fissure, his face slack, his eyes void of recognition. He took a step toward them, whistling that terrible, mocking tune, acting as the herald for the monster standing behind him. He's one of them now," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a horror beyond madness. Elena backed away, tears streaming down her face, stumbling deeper into the dark tunnel. Mark began to squeeze his body into the crack, his broken bones grinding against the stone, coming for them not as a friend, but as a weapon. The sound of Mark's body forcing itself into the fissure was a grotesque symphony of friction and fracture. It was the noise of wet meat sliding against granite, punctuated by the dry, rhythmic clicking of his broken arm dragging uselessly against the stone floor. Elena clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob, the vibration of her own terror rattling her teeth. "Move, Elena, move!" Sarah's voice was a ragged whisper, her fingernails digging into Elena's bicep, dragging her backward into the suffocating throat of the cave. They scrambled away from the entrance, their boots slipping on patches of damp moss and loose shale. The tunnel was narrow, a jagged intestine within the earth that smelled of ancient decay and stagnant water. With every step, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against their eyeballs, heavy and absolute. They had no light source save for the faint, ghostly after-image of the green pulsation from outside, which faded rapidly the deeper they went, leaving them to navigate by touch and instinct alone. Behind them, the whistling continued. It was no longer the cheerful tune Mark used to hum while driving his Jeep or cooking over a campfire. Amplified by the acoustics of the Saint-Bon corridor, the melody warped into something screeching and metallic. It bounced off the walls, overlapping with itself until it sounded like a choir of the damned heralding their arrival. It was a sonar ping of nightmare, telling them exactly how close he was. And he was fast. "He's not stopping," Elena gasped, her chest heaving as the air grew thinner and colder. "Sarah, he's not stopping." "That's not Mark," Sarah hissed, though her voice wavered with tears. She kept one hand on the rough, slimy wall to guide them, pulling Elena along with the other. "Don't look back. Just keep your feet moving." They stumbled through the blackness, knees banging against protruding rocks, palms scraping raw on the limestone. Time lost its meaning in the void. There was only the frantic rhythm of their heartbeats and the relentless, shuffling pursuit behind them. The tunnel began to slope downward, the gradient steepening aggressively. The air grew heavy with moisture, and the distant sound of rushing water began to rumble beneath the soles of their feet, competing with the maddening whistle. Suddenly, the narrow passage opened up. The oppressive claustrophobia of the tunnel gave way to a vast, hollow emptiness. Elena skidded to a halt, her toes hanging over a precipice. She kicked a loose stone over the edge, waiting for the sound of impact. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Splash. They had emerged onto a subterranean ledge overlooking a massive cavern. While the tunnel had been pitch black, this cavern was illuminated by a sickly, bioluminescent fungus that clung to the ceiling like constellations of rot. The pale blue light revealed a sheer drop into a churning underground river below, black and oily, rushing with the violence of a flood. "Dead end," Elena whispered, the words choking her. "It's a dead end." "No," Sarah said frantically, scanning the ledge. It was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand abreast, winding along the wall of the cavern before disappearing around a bend of stalactites. "There, we have to shimmy across. It's the only way." The whistling grew louder. It was right at the tunnel mouth they had just exited. Elena turned her head. Emerging from the shadows of the tunnel, bathed in the corpse light of the cavern, was Mark. He looked like a marionette with its strings cut and then reattached by a sadist. His clothes were torn, his skin scraped raw from squeezing through the rocks. His left arm, the one the killer had snapped, swung like a pendulum, the bone clearly misaligned, the hand twisting at an impossible angle. But it was his face that froze Elena's blood. It was slack, devoid of tension or emotion, a blank canvas of flesh. Yet his eyes were wide open, the pupils dilated so fully that the irises were gone, leaving only twin pools of abyss. And from his lips that perfect, trilling whistle continued, uninterrupted by his labored breathing. He didn't run. He didn't lunge. He simply walked toward them with a terrifying, jerky purpose. "Go!" Elena screamed, shoving Sarah toward the narrow traverse. "Go, Sarah!" Sarah pressed her back against the rock wall and began to inch sideways along the ledge. Elena followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stone was slick with condensation. One slip meant a fall into the freezing, violent water below. Mark stepped onto the ledge. He didn't bother to press his back to the wall. He walked straight, balancing with an unnatural grace, as if gravity held no dominion over him anymore. "Elena." The voice wasn't whistling anymore. Mark spoke, but the timbre was wrong. It was deep, resonant, and layered, as if 2 voices were speaking at once. Mark's familiar tenor overlaid with a guttural, grinding bass. "Elena, why do you run from salvation?" Elena sobbed, her foot slipping on a patch of slime. She flailed, barely catching herself on a jagged outcropping. She was 10 feet out on the ledge. Sarah was 5 feet ahead of her. Mark was closing the distance, his broken arm dragging against the cavern wall, leaving a smear of blood on the glowing fungus. "You are not Mark!" Elena screamed back, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. The thing that wore Mark's face stopped. The whistling ceased abruptly. A smile slowly stretched across his face, too wide, tearing the corners of his mouth. "Mark is here," the dual voice mocked. "He is watching. He is screaming. He wants you to join us." Mark lunged. He covered the distance with a burst of speed that shouldn't have been possible for a human on a slippery ledge. Elena shrieked, scrambling backward, colliding with Sarah. The impact nearly sent them both over the edge. Sarah cried out as her foot slipped off the stone, her body swinging out over the abyss, her hands frantically clawing at Elena's jacket. "I've got you!" Elena gasped, grabbing Sarah's forearm with both hands, anchoring herself against a stalagmite. She strained, her muscles screaming, holding Sarah's weight as the black water roared below. But as she looked up, her vision filled with the sight of Mark standing over them. He loomed there, the bioluminescence casting hollow shadows over his eyes. He looked down at Elena, holding Sarah's life in her hands, and he tilted his head like a curious bird. He raised his good hand, not to help, but to strike. Elena braced for the blow, but Mark didn't hit her. Instead, he reached down and wrapped his fingers around Elena's wrist, the one holding Sarah. His grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. He didn't pull them up. He began to pry Elena's fingers loose one by one. "Let her go," the voice whispered, intimate and horrific, directly into Elena's ear. "Let her fall, and I will let you live." Elena stared into the void of his eyes, feeling her grip on Sarah slipping as Mark's unnatural strength forced her hand open. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with the realization of what was happening, her mouth forming a silent plea as her fingernails scrabbled uselessly against Elena's sleeve. Mark smiled that impossible smile again, and with a sickening pop, he snapped Elena's index finger back. A scream tore from Elena's throat, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed instantly by the oppressive darkness of the cavern. The pain was a white-hot spike driving itself through her hand and up her arm, momentarily blinding her. It was a sensation so absolute that it threatened to sever her connection to reality, to make her let go, simply to cradle the agony. But she didn't let go. If anything, the shock of the violence triggered a surge of adrenaline that overrode the pain, if only for a fleeting second. Elena stared into the face of the thing that looked like her friend, the slack jaw, the eyes that held a void where a soul should be, and she felt a hatred bloom within her that was hotter than the fire in her finger. "No," she snarled, the word guttural. Mark's head tilted to the other side, the bone-cracking sound of his neck echoing in the silence. He seemed disappointed, like a child bored with a toy that wouldn't break correctly. He tightened his grip on her wrist, preparing to snap the next digit. "Do it, Elena!" Sarah screamed from below, her voice thick with tears and terror. "Let me go. Save yourself." "Shut up," Elena gritted out. She wasn't talking to Sarah. She looked past Mark, not at his face, but at his footing. He was arrogant. He stood on the slick, moss-covered stone with the confidence of a predator that believed its prey was already dead. He had leaned forward to torture her, shifting his center of gravity. Elena stopped pulling. Instead, she threw her entire body weight forward. It was a suicidal move. She lunged toward the killer, using the stalagmite she was hooked around as a fulcrum. She didn't aim for his face or his chest. She drove her knee upward with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed, aiming directly for his groin. The impact was solid. Even a possessed vessel had biological weaknesses. Mark let out a dual-toned grunt of surprise and pain. His iron grip on her wrist faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough. Elena ripped her hand free, the broken finger flopping uselessly, sending fresh waves of nausea through her. "Climb!" Elena screamed at the abyss, ignoring the tears blurring her vision. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. Fueled by the adrenaline of near death, she scrambled, her boots finding purchase on the uneven rock face. Elena grabbed the back of Sarah's jacket with her good hand and heaved, her muscles burning, until Sarah tumbled over the lip of the ledge and collapsed onto the damp stone floor beside her. They didn't wait to check on Mark. They didn't look back to see if he was recovering. They scrambled to their feet, slipping on the wet rock, and ran. The cave system was a labyrinth of nightmares. They sprinted blindly into the dark, their flashlights cutting erratic swaths through the gloom. The air grew colder, heavy with the metallic tang of ancient minerals and the rot of something long dead. Every shadow seemed to stretch and reach for them. Every dripping stalactite looked like a jagged tooth waiting to snap shut. Behind them, the whistling started again. It wasn't the cheerful, disjointed tune from before. It was a low, rising trill echoing off the walls from everywhere and nowhere at once. It sounded like the wind through a graveyard, like a warning that the hunt had only just begun. "My finger!" Elena gasped, clutching her hand to her chest as they ran. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a throbbing, sickening pulse of agony. I think I'm going to pass out." "Don't you dare!" Sarah panted, grabbing Elena's good arm and hauling her forward. "We have to find the exit. David said the airflow." They stopped at a fork in the tunnel. To the left, the path descended into black water that swirled ominously. To the right, a narrow fissure in the rock wall led upward, a tight squeeze that looked suffocating. "Up," Sarah decided. "Heat rises, air rises, we go up." They squeezed into the fissure. The rock pressed against them from all sides, cold and slimy, triggering a fresh wave of claustrophobia. Elena had to drag her injured hand carefully, every bump against the rough stone sending jolts of lightning through her nervous system. They shimmed sideways, inch by agonizing inch, the darkness pressing in on their chests. Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, expectant. "He can't fit in here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He's too big. Mark was broad-shouldered. He can't follow us." Elena wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that the laws of physics still applied to the monster wearing her friend's skin. But as they shuffled deeper into the fissure, the rock began to vibrate. A low hum resonated through the stone, vibrating against their spines. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a sound, a voice. "Where are you going?" The voice didn't come from behind them. It came from the rock itself, transmitted through the walls of the cave as if the mountain were speaking. Panic surged anew, and they scrambled faster, scraping their skin raw against the stone. Finally, the fissure widened, dumping them out into a vast, spherical chamber. Elena swept her flashlight around, and her heart plummeted. It wasn't an exit. The chamber was a dead end, a hollow bubble inside the earth. But it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with thousands of small, hollowed-out niches, and inside each niche sat a skull, human, animal, and things that looked like neither, all arranged in perfect, spiraling geometric patterns that drew the eye to the center of the room. In the center lay a pool of water, perfectly still, black as ink. "No," Sarah whimpered, backing away until her back hit the wall of skulls. "No, no, no. There's no way out." Elena gripped her wrist, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. She swept the light back toward the fissure they had just squeezed through, their only escape route. A hand emerged from the crack. It wasn't Mark's hand. It was pale, elongated, with too many joints in the fingers. Then another hand appeared above it. Then a face pressed into the opening, illuminated by the spill of their flashlights. It was Mark, but his face had changed. The pressure of the tight squeeze had done something to him. His jaw was unhinged, hanging loosely against his chest, and the skin of his face had peeled back from his forehead, revealing the wet, pulsating muscle beneath. He wasn't stuck. He was fluid. He was pouring himself into the fissure like oil, his bones cracking and shifting to accommodate the narrow space. He dragged himself into the chamber, rising from the floor like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. He stood between them and the only exit, his broken smile widening until it split his cheeks completely. "Found you," he gurgled. Elena stepped back, her boot heel catching on the edge of the central pool. She glanced down, and for the first time, she saw what was beneath the surface of the black water. It wasn't a reflection. The water was clear, and looking up from the depths, floating suspended in the abyss beneath the cave floor, were the preserved floating bodies of the missing hikers from years ago. And all of their eyes were open, staring directly at her. "Join us," the voices whispered, not from Mark, but from the water. Mark lunged. Elena threw herself sideways, tackling Sarah just as Mark's elongated fingers slashed through the air where they had been standing a heartbeat before. The sound was sickening, a wet, whistling tear like a scythe cutting through tall grass. Mark's momentum carried him into the wall of skulls, his body impacting with a crunch that sent ancient bone fragments raining down like hail. "Get up!" Elena screamed, scrambling for purchase on the slick, uneven floor. Sarah was hyperventilating, her eyes locked on the spot where Mark was untangling himself from the niche he had crashed into. He didn't move like a human anymore. His limbs possessed too many elbows, bending backwards and sideways with the fluidity of an arachnid. He rotated his head a full 180 degrees, the skin of his neck twisting like a wrung-out towel, until his ruined, lidless eyes fixed upon them. "Sarah, look at me, not at him!" Elena shook her friend violently. The terror had turned Sarah into dead weight. Mark chattered, a sound that emanated from the exposed cavity of his throat rather than his mouth. He pushed off the wall, his limbs elongating further, spanning the distance of the small chamber with terrifying reach. He wasn't running. He was flowing toward them, closing the gap with predatory leisure. Elena dragged Sarah backward, her boots skidding on the damp stone until her heels hovered over the precipice of the central pool. The cold emanating from the black water was absolute, a physical barrier of frost that climbed up her spine. "Join us," the water whispered again, a chorus of drowned sorrow that vibrated in Elena's molars. She risked a glance down. The pale faces beneath the surface were drifting closer, their mouths moving in synchronized silent prayer. It was a choice between the butcher in front of them or the abyss behind. Mark lunged again, this time low. Elena kicked out instinctively, her heavy boot connecting with what should have been his shoulder. Instead of solid bone and muscle, her foot sank into something soft and yielding, like rotting dough. Mark giggled, a wet, bubbling sound, and clamped his hand around her ankle. His grip was iron cold. "Let go!" Elena shrieked, thrashing wildly. She grabbed a loose femur from the pile of bones beside her and brought it down with all her strength onto Mark's wrist. The bone shattered on impact, but it did enough damage to sever the tension in his tendons. His fingers spasmed open. Elena scrambled back, pulling her leg free, leaving a smear of black sludge on her pant leg where he had touched her. "There's nowhere to go, Ellie," Mark gurgled, rising to his full, grotesque height. He blocked the fissure completely now. His chest cavity heaved, expanding and contracting rhythmically as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. "The forest chose us. It wants to keep us, just like them." He gestured a jagged finger toward the pool. Sarah suddenly stopped screaming. A strange, glassy calm washed over her face. She stood up, swaying slightly, and turned her back to the monster. She looked down into the ink-black water. "They look peaceful," Sarah murmured, her voice hollow. "They aren't running anymore." "Sarah, don't you dare," Elena warned, backing away from Mark as he took another step. The room was shrinking. The walls of skulls seemed to be leaning in, the geometric spiral spinning in her peripheral vision, inducing a nauseating vertigo. "It's better than him," Sarah whispered. Before Elena could grab her, Sarah leaned forward and allowed gravity to take her. She didn't splash. She slipped into the water with barely a ripple, as if the surface were merely a veil of smoke. She didn't struggle. She simply sank, her hair fanning out like a halo, her eyes wide open, joining the gallery of the dead. "Sarah!" Elena screamed, lunging for the edge. She saw Sarah's hand reaching up, not in a plea for help, but in invitation. And beneath Sarah, deeper in the abyss, something massive stirred. The other bodies were scattering, pushed aside by a rising shadow that dwarfed the small chamber. Elena looked back. Mark was right there. He had stopped playing. His jaw unhinged completely, dropping to his sternum, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that spiraled down his throat, a mirror of the room's design. He coiled his legs, preparing for the final strike that would tear her apart. Elena looked at the teeth, then at the black water. Death by shredding, or death by drowning. But the water hadn't killed Sarah instantly. She was still drifting, still looking up. Elena made her choice. As Mark sprang forward, his claws aiming for her throat, she didn't dodge. She threw herself backward, tucking her chin to her chest. The darkness swallowed her whole. The shock of the cold was paralyzing. It felt less like water and more like liquid nitrogen, stealing the breath from her lungs in a single agonizing second. Silence slammed into her ears, cutting off Mark's inhuman screeching instantly. She opened her eyes in the gloom. The water was impossibly clear. Above her, the surface rippled like a dark mirror. She saw the distorted shape of Mark thrashing at the edge, refusing to enter the water, as if it were holy ground he could not desecrate. Elena kicked downward, her lungs burning, looking for Sarah. She spotted her friend a few meters below, suspended in the void. But Sarah wasn't alone. The shadow Elena had seen from above was coalescing. It wasn't a creature. It was a structure. Buried beneath the pool, submerged in this subterranean aquifer, was the spire of a sunken cathedral. And the bodies weren't just floating. They were tethered. Thin, translucent tendrils extended from the cathedral's broken stained glass windows, wrapping around the ankles of the drowned hikers. And now a tendril was snaking its way toward Sarah. Elena swam harder, fighting the viscous pressure of the deep. She grabbed Sarah's jacket, shaking her, but Sarah was catatonic. Elena looked up to gauge their distance to the surface, hoping to drag them both up for air. That was when she saw it. Mark hadn't stopped at the edge. A long, pale arm plunged through the surface, followed by another. He was lengthening himself, stretching his limbs like taffy to reach down into the depths without fully submerging his torso. His fingers, now tipped with bone spurs, hooked into the fabric of Elena's shirt. She tried to kick him away, but the water made her movements sluggish. Mark pulled, dragging her upward toward the surface, toward the teeth waiting above. At the same time, the tendril from the cathedral below lashed out, wrapping tightly around Elena's other ankle, pulling her down into the dark. Caught in a tug of war between the monster above and the ancient horror below, Elena felt her spine stretched to the breaking point. Her air ran out. She opened her mouth to scream, and the black water rushed in. Ice flooded her chest, extinguishing the fire in her lungs. The agony of the stretch, bone against unnatural bone, eclipsed the fear of death. She was a wishbone snapping between a creature of chaotic violence and a tomb of eternal order. Yet, as the darkness encroached, the cathedral's tendril pulsed against her skin, not with malice, but with a sedated ancient rhythm. It offered not life, but sanctuary. Elena stopped fighting the deep. With a final spasmodic jerk, she twisted her body, driving her heel into Mark's brittle, overextended forearm. It snapped with a vibration she felt rather than heard. Mark recoiled, his grip faltering as he retracted his shattered limb into the dry world above. Instantly, the abyss claimed its due. Elena and Sarah plummeted past the broken stained glass, fully enveloped by the translucent vines. The crushing pressure vanished, replaced by a narcotic numbness. As her vision faded, Elena saw the other tethered bodies not as rotting victims, but as a sleeping congregation. She took her place among them, suspended forever in the hallowed watery dark, safe at last from the monsters of the earth. And so they slept, cradled by the eternal deep.